simply shoveled into mass graves and forgotten about. There were no memorials and no means for families to visit where their loved ones had fallen, even if they'd been told precisely where the burial had taken place, which was not very often. A few memorials were set up, especially in the great public schools, at the end of the Boer War in South Africa at the end of the 19th century. But these were memorials to just the officers. The serving privates and the corporals and the sergeants and the lance jacks apparently did not count. That's actually the Boer War memorial outside my old school in Cheltenham College, and all the names on that are the names of the officers who were killed. However, the British Army of 1914-18 was largely a volunteer army. For the first time there were teachers, there were lawyers, doctors, clergymen, skilled craftsmen, members of Parliament, even the centre forward of the England football team, and a Reading connection here, Polton Palmer, after whom Palmer Park in Reading is named. You probably didn't know that, but there's another example of memorials to the dead of the Great War. These men were buried across the Channel, on the battlefields where they'd fallen, far away from the homes that they had left when they joined up to fight. And it was quickly decided, even while the war was on, that every dead soldier would be given a marked grave in France or Belgium if the identity of the body was known. If the grave was unmarked or the body could not be identified, then all the names of the missing would be recorded on a memorial in Flanders. At the same time, the names of the dead would be memorialised here in Britain. Now, these memorials are to be found scattered here in every city, every town, every village in the UK. They're so familiar that we hardly notice them. There was a famous occasion, in fact, when an ITV film of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, supposedly set in 1800, contained a scene filmed around a war memorial which would not have existed until a century later. Now, this is our local Caversham Memorial down by the Thames. Many of you have walked past it, scarcely even noticing that it was there. And this is the remarkable war cemetery at Cemetery Junction on the A4 outside Reading, on the way out of Reading. And it's got a cross of sacrifice. You can see the Portland stone cross, and you can see the sword made out of metal that's placed on top of it. It's very, very unusual to have one of those in the United Kingdom. They're normally only found in military cemeteries overseas. And if you go to Cemetery Junction, the vast majority of the burials are members of the Royal Berkshire Regiment, our local regiment, which was based in the Brock Barracks. But it's two national memorials which I'd like to tell you a little bit about this morning. For the mothers and the children, and the sisters and the brothers who'd lost a soldier on the Western Front, France and Belgium might have been on the other side of the moon for all the chances they had of visiting the country after the war was over. Remember, this was 1918. Most of the inhabitants of Reading would have felt themselves lucky if they'd been to London just once in their lives. Many families had simply received a notice that their son or brother or father was missing, believed killed, often without a French or even a Belgian town or village as a location. There was a desperate need for a focus for the mourning, which engulfed the United Kingdom after the war was over. And the first of these national memorials is this cenotaph in London, in Whitehall. Now, the monument was designed by my all-time favourite architect, Edwin Lutyens. Splendid chap, man of huge integrity, formidable intellect, an atheist, that's someone who doesn't believe in any god, but a chap's chap, a lover of good claret, and a very accomplished practical joker. Incidentally, there are several Lutyens houses scattered all over the south of England, several in Beaconsfield, including one next door to where my mother lives, and a very important one in Sonning. Who knows, some of you actually may be lucky enough to live in a Lutyens designed house. Anyway, the cenotaph in Whitehall is one of Lutyens' great public work, and started life as a temporary structure in 1919, made out of plaster and wood. However, it immediately became such a centre of intense national remembrance from the day after it was unveiled that the decision was quickly taken to make the memorial a permanent structure made out of Portland stone. The idea behind the cenotaph, indeed any cenotaph, is that it's an empty tomb. The idea originated with the ancient Egyptians and the Greeks, and this is an Egyptian example, and the structure is a commemoration of warriors lost in war and buried on the battlefield rather than at home. Now Edwin Lutyens, rigorously resisted the bishops of the Church of England who wanted the monument to be given Christian imagery. He refused even to allow a cross to be inscribed, insisting, quite correctly I think, that few of the dead of the Great War were thinking of God when they joined up, and that many of the dead were Jews, agnostics and atheists anyway. Instead, the cenotaph is simply inscribed with these words, "The glorious dead," a phrase suggested by the Prime Minister at the time, Lord George. There are also wreaths carved into the stone at each corner. As you can see, the response of the grieving public was immediate and huge, and the scene in Whitehall there was a mass of flowers, and I'm reminded a little of the public reaction to the death of Princess Diana in our own time. So, watch the Remembrance service on the television this Sunday, or even better, actually go and watch it in London, as the Queen leads the nation in mourning, not only now, of course, for the dead of the Great War, but also of the Second World War, and all of the small wars of peace which have followed, where British troops have died. The entire modern ceremony is arranged around the cenotaph, and I defy anyone to be present and not to be moved. And that, I think, is what great architecture can do. I think Edwin Lutyens would be pleased. Now, the second great national memorial is, of course, the tomb of the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey, the nation's parish church. The lower fours won't have seen this yet, unless they've been to Westminster Abbey with their parents, but the rest of you will have walked past the memorial on your way to your seats for our Westminster service, without perhaps possibly quite knowing what the tomb is. The story is a remarkable one, and I hope you find it interesting. It was this priest called David Railton who came up with the idea. He'd served as an army chaplain during the war, and in 1916 he came across a rough cross in the back garden of a house in Armentières in northern France, which was inscribed with the words, "An unknown British soldier." The idea was simple. A single soldier who could never be identified would be taken from the battlefields of France and Belgium and buried in Westminster Abbey. So families which had lost a son or a father would be given the comfort of knowing that the body lying there might just be that of their own loved one. As you know, the British are rather good at these kind of ceremonies, and an enormous amount of thought went into the formal arrangements. In 1920, the old battlefields were still being systematically searched for the missing dead. Some areas where the fighting was especially intense were combed through 6, 7, even 8 times. But of course, many soldiers had been buried deep in old shell holes or in backfilled trenches. From the battlefields, 4 British soldiers were dug up from the Somme, which some of you have visited, Ypres, Arras, and the Aisne, which is just east of Paris. And these bodies, these 4 bodies, were taken with great ceremony to a chapel in Saint-Paul-sur-Ternoise in northern France and left under guard overnight. During that night, a general went into the chapel and chose one of the 4 bodies laid out in stretchers. In the gloom, the general did not even know from which battlefield the body he had chosen had come. The other 3 bodies were then reburied as a soldier of the Great War, known unto God. And incidentally, those words were chosen by Rudyard Kipling, who wrote the Jungle Book, which many of you will have read. He lost his beloved son, his only child, John Kipling, during the First World War, and his body was never found, never identified. The chosen man was then placed in a plain pine coffin, which was transported to the great Basilica Church in Boulogne. After the wooden coffin had rested overnight, it was placed in another coffin, specially brought over from England, made of 2-inch thick oak, which was in turn lined with zinc. Within the wrought iron bands of the coffin was placed a genuine 16th century Crusader sword which came from the Tower of London collection. And the completed coffin now made its way from France on board HMS Verdun to Dover, and then by train to Victoria Station in London, where it rested overnight. And then, on the morning of the 11th of November 1920, the coffin was transported on a gown carriage through the crowded streets of London, drawn by 6 black horses and passing the cenotaph on its way to the Abbey. And at exactly 11 o'clock, the moment when the guns had fallen silent on the Western Front on the 11th of November 1918, after a short ceremony, the coffin was carried past an honour guard of 100 servicemen who had won the Victoria Cross during the war, and then lowered into the grave in the Abbey. This had been dug the previous night in its now familiar location at the west end of the nave. King George V dropped a handful of French soil onto the coffin as it was covered over. And precisely at the same time, the French unknown warrior was placed in his final resting place in Paris, beneath the Arc de Triomphe. Once again, and not surprisingly, the response of the public was enormous. Hundreds of thousands of mourners queued to file past the grave during the following week before it was finally sealed. It's thought that 5 to 6 million people passed the grave in the course of that week. Aren't they smart? All the gentlemen in ties and jackets, the ladies all wearing hats. Do you remember hats? We've got very sloppy, haven't we? We've got very scruffy over the years. And partly it's a sign of respect, but I think it's a wonderful picture there of the time. The gentlemen, of course, have removed it as a mark of respect. And then, on the 18th of November, the grave was filled using 100 sandbags of French earth. And the final chapter of the story was completed on the following 11th of November in 1921, when the temporary stone was replaced by the black marble stone, which we all now know. Now, as an English teacher, I have to admit, I love these words which were inscribed on the tomb. They're old-fashioned, and they certainly belong to another age. They did things differently, I think, than in the past. But they make the point very movingly. Beneath this stone rests the body of a British warrior, unknown by name or rank, brought from France to lie among the most illustrious of the land, and buried here on Armistice Day, 11th of November 1920, in the presence of His Majesty King George V. Now, illustrious means the most famous, because of course Westminster Abbey is where the kings and the queens and the nobility and the ambassadors, all the royalty of England have been buried. So he's been buried among the most illustrious of the land. And here's the key bit. They buried him among the kings because he had done good toward God and toward his house. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, SJ, again.